In a quiet American town, where the streetlights hummed softly every night, an old widower named Thomas lived alone in a small white house at the end of Maple Street. The paint on the wooden fence had started to fade, and the porch swing creaked even when no one sat on it, as if it still remembered the laughter that once filled the air. Every morning, Thomas followed the same routine. He would wake before sunrise, slowly walk to the kitchen, and make 2 cups of coffee. One he kept for himself, and the other he carefully placed across the table, exactly where his wife Eleanor used to sit. He never touched that second cup. It would sit there, steaming quietly until the warmth faded, just like the memories he tried so hard to hold on to. Eleanor had passed away 8 years earlier after a long battle with illness, and since then the house had become painfully silent. The clock ticking on the wall sounded louder than it should, and at night the empty hallway felt like it stretched forever. Thomas had no children, no close relatives nearby, and very few neighbors who truly knew him. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his voice carried the weight of years of loneliness. One freezing winter evening, snow began falling earlier than expected, covering the streets in a thick white blanket. Thomas was sitting by his window when he noticed a figure near his mailbox. It was a teenage boy, thin and shaking, sitting on the curb with his head lowered and arms wrapped around himself for warmth. The boy wore only a light jacket, completely unprepared for the bitter cold. For a long moment, Thomas simply watched. He wasn't used to people coming near his house, and part of him hesitated, unsure whether to step outside. But something about the boy's stillness felt painfully familiar, the quiet kind of sadness that doesn't cry out loud. After a few minutes, Thomas slowly stood up, took a thick blanket from the closet, and poured a fresh cup of hot coffee. He stepped outside, his breath visible in the icy air, and walked toward the boy without saying a word. When he gently placed the blanket around the boy's shoulders, the boy flinched slightly but didn't pull away. Thomas held out the cup and said softly, "It's too cold to sit alone tonight." The boy hesitated before taking the cup. His hands trembled so much that some of the coffee spilled, but he held it tightly as if it were the only warm thing left in his life. After a long silence, he whispered, "My name is Caleb." His voice cracked as he spoke, and it became clear he hadn't talked to anyone kindly in a long time. Over the next few days, Caleb returned. At first, he only sat quietly on the curb, never asking to come inside. Thomas would bring him coffee or food, and they would sit in silence. Slowly, the silence began to change. Caleb started talking about his life, how his mother had died suddenly the previous year, how he had been forced to live with distant relatives who constantly reminded him he was unwanted, and how one night he simply walked away because the loneliness at home felt worse than the cold outside. Thomas never interrupted him. He simply listened, nodding occasionally, understanding every unspoken feeling. For the first time in years, Thomas found himself speaking too. He told Caleb about Eleanor, about how she used to sing while cooking, about how she believed kindness was the only thing that truly lasted in life. As weeks passed, Caleb began helping Thomas with small things, fixing a loose fence board, shoveling snow, cleaning the porch. The house slowly felt different. The air inside no longer felt heavy, and sometimes faint laughter could be heard from the kitchen. One morning, Thomas placed 2 cups of coffee on the table as usual, but this time, when Caleb walked in, Thomas gently pushed the second cup toward him and said with a small smile, "No cup should stay full forever." Years passed, and Caleb never left. He finished school, found work, and continued living in that small white house, not as a guest, but as family. The neighbors who once barely noticed Thomas now saw him sitting on the porch with Caleb, talking, smiling, and sometimes simply watching the sunset together. One quiet autumn night, Thomas passed away peacefully in his sleep, a faint smile still on his face.
The next morning, neighbors saw Caleb sitting alone on the porch swing, holding 2 cups of coffee in his hands. Tears streamed down his face, but he wasn't sobbing loudly. He simply whispered into the silent air, "You weren't alone, and you didn't leave me alone either." And in that still moment, as the morning sun rose gently over Maple Street, it became clear that sometimes family isn't the one you're born into. It's the one that finds you when your heart feels most empty, stays when the world walks away, and quietly turns loneliness into love.